Hi, Brandon.
Hi, how are you?
Good. I'm excited to do this.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. Okay, so I've been following your work for forever, ever since I was editor of our college paper, UGA.
Yes.
So we ran a story then because Humans of New York was getting so much traction and it was so popular with 64,000 Facebook fans in 2012. Yeah. So at the time, you had 64,000 fans and you had photographed almost 4,000 people. And that was 8 years ago. Today, your community has grown to more than 20 million people on social media. How does it feel to reflect on that?
Well, I don't allow myself too much time for reflection, which might be a kind of quirk of my character. I was telling Mike, because I actually, the publication week for my first book, or my third book, sorry, just ended. And I was like texting my agent. I was like, I don't know what to do with myself when I don't have something to worry about. Like I need something to worry about at all times. So I'm normally obsessing over the next thing I'm doing as opposed to kind of reflecting over the arc of the career so far. I think the one story that I always tell to kind of put into perspective how much the success of Humans of New York was outsized in relation to my expectations. I'd been in New York for a few months and I've been doing it every single day, trying to get traction, trying to get something going, and it really wasn't working. I was posting photos every single day, and it's very hard to get that first core group of fans, especially this was at the very beginning of social media. Facebook pages were just a thing, things going viral.
This is 2010.
2010, yeah. I remember my Facebook page started getting 10 new followers a week. And it's 10 new followers a day. That was it. And I went to Central Park. I remember it was the night of the supermoon, and I was with my friend. And I told him, if this keeps going like this, in 3 years, I will have 10,000 Facebook fans. And to me, that sounded like the biggest success that anybody could possibly ever imagine. I think at that time, once those 3 years passed, it was something closer to 10 million.
Wow.
Yeah, it was like 1,000 times larger than my definition of what a success would have been, is what ended up happening.
So I remember you, I think on a podcast, said that there was one Christmas Eve where kind of like all your insecurities came crashing down, where you were like, I'm not sure that this is going to work. How did you, in the early days of Humans of New York, how did you keep those like insecurities and doubts at bay?
Just working. I think because I think mainly, that first Christmas holiday, the Christmas you're referencing was the first one I was in New York.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know anybody in New York. I knew like two people. And when during the Christmas break, the two people that I did know went home. And so I was like completely alone there for like 2 or 3 weeks. That was extremely tough. That was more of just kind of like a loneliness thing, I think, than an insecurity thing. But I dealt with both of those two things in the exact same way, which is I, went out and worked. It was the only thing that would keep me from thinking about the possibility of failing, and not just failing in a very, grand way, because I had packed up everything I had, moved to New York, didn't know anybody, to start this Facebook project where I'd send direct messages to all my friends and family asking them to follow it. So I was on everybody I knew's radar in New York, doing something that seemed absolutely stupid. Stopping pictures of random people and posting them on Facebook. I mean, in hindsight, it seems like a fantastic idea. I see people on Twitter like, oh man, if I had a time machine, I'd go steal the Humans of New York guy's idea. But at the time I was doing it, it seemed like the stupidest idea ever. My friend, there's that South Park episode, like I don't even really remember seeing it. It was like about the underwear gnomes, where the gnomes had like this big plan where they were going to like steal a bunch of underwear, and then somehow that was going to equal profit. And my friend always told me, like, I reminded him of the underwear gnomes. Like, okay, so you're just going to take pictures of random people on the street and somehow that's going to equal profit. Okay. Like somehow you're going to make a living doing that. And that's how it looked for a long time. It looked very quixotic. Like I was doing something crazy, just taking random pictures of people and putting it on Facebook. I always just felt that there was something interesting about the intimate portrait of a stranger on the street. I felt that was compelling, and I felt that was interesting. And I knew there was nobody else doing it in any kind of systematic way. Street photography had been a thing for a while. Part of street photography sometimes was candid photography of people. There was much less portraits of people on the street, especially when you stopped and asked somebody for permission. I knew I was doing something new. I knew I was doing something that was compelling. And I believed that if I made it my thing, if I owned that idea and I owned that space because I got out there first and I worked the hardest at it, that eventually the intrinsic value and how compelling it was would attract an audience large enough to at least sustain myself and make a living so I could continue doing it. That was my only goal at first, was I just wanted to make enough money to continue doing it, which is remarkably easier to accomplish than having best-selling books and, a very large audience. So I think that helped, that my aims weren't sky high.
How did you make money in the very early days?
I just lost my job. And so I, had a little bit of money coming in from unemployment. I got a few small odd jobs, doing photography, weddings, little stuff like that. I remember my first saving grace, like Humans of New York. Well, the first saving grace was I did a print sale. Like after the day my unemployment ran out, I can remember I logged on and I thought another check was coming and it said, "You're done." I had nothing, zero, nothing. Like if my camera broke, I remember one of the scariest moments for me was I walked upstairs and I like had set my camera on top of the microwave or something, but I couldn't find it. And I turned, and that to me represented death because I had no money. And I'd been in New York for a couple months, and I was like, if I lost my camera, it was all over. That's how broke I was. And so once the money completely ran out, I did a GoFundMe. Not a GoFundMe. It was Indiegogo back then. And it was a print sale. It wasn't me just asking for money. I was selling prints, and that raised $30,000. And I was like, oh, wow, this is going to last me 3 years, and because I was just spending nothing at that time. And then things started happening very quickly. The first view I got into, how much social media allows you to scale. I remember Amtrak. It's the only commercial gig I've ever done. Keep in mind, I'd only been photographing for about a year and a half. I am not that great of a photographer at the time, and I'm still learning. But Amtrak, I remember they gave me, they came and they asked, they asked me, if I would do a shoot for them.
Like Humans of Amtrak?
Basically. The only commercial job I've ever done. And they asked me, and this is again, I'd only been photographing for a year. I didn't even know how to use my camera. I had to hire an assistant because I shot everything on auto at the time. I had to hire an assistant. And the way that I did it is we found somebody to photograph. I handed him the camera. He set it all up, and then I took the picture. That's how little I knew about photography at the time. And I remember they asked me how much money I wanted. And I go, they're like, maybe you should get an agent. Most people have agents. I go, I don't know. It's this older lady. I remember her name. I won't say it though. And, I think I kind of tapped into something maternal in her. And I was just like, yeah, I don't know. I'm just out here in New York trying to make it, whatever you think, you could do would be great. And they ended up giving me $60,000 for 2 weeks of work. And To me, that was all the money in the world, all the money in the world. I'm just like, I'm not going to have to worry about anything else for years with this. So that was when I finally started to feel secure, and things were growing so fast at that point that, between the GoFundMe and the Amtrak thing, I just knew by the time that money ran out, I was going to be in a completely different world.
And of course, the red and black
there you
profile.
Go. This red and black profile stratosphere. That's when I left orbit.
Truly. So for 10 years, you've picked up your camera, hit the pavement day after day. I mean, when I look at you, like, I put out a newsletter every Sunday, and I've done it for 3 years. But when I look at you, you're like the ultimate example of persistence and consistency, and day after day, year after year. What has kept you going so long?
I mean, in the beginning, it was just rock solid discipline, and I can say that as somebody who flunked out of college and who for the majority of my life was not a disciplined person at all. I flunked out of UGA because I wasn't going to class. I was the guy who was begging the teacher if he could turn in the final essay 3 days late. I never had discipline ever. When I flunked out of school, I read an autobiography of Ben Franklin and just saw how he lived his life and how structured and how disciplined he was. And I started, inculcating habits in my life. The first one is I read 100 pages a day, every single day for years. Even when I went back to school, I went back to University of Georgia, I ended up making straight A's. Even during that time, I would read 100 pages a day on top of this reading for school, mostly nonfiction. I started exercising every day and playing piano for an hour every single day. And I did those things every single day for years. And yes, I got a lot better at piano. I won't say I'm good at piano, but, I got proficient at piano. I was in good shape, and I educated myself pretty intensely. But I think the most important thing that was happening during that time is that I was learning discipline. I got very good. Not only did my habits, improve me in many ways, but I also got very good at the skill of creating habits in my life. And so when Humans of New York came along, I knew, I'd had enough experience creating habits that I knew taking a day off wasn't about the day of work that you lost. It was about breaking that habit. And so no matter how I felt, no matter how, whatever, insecure I was, lonely I was, feeling sick, whatever, I went out and photographed every single day. And for years and years and years and years, I posted 4 posts a day, every single day. And this was when, Humans of New York was dovetailing with the rise of Facebook. There was a time, if you want me to get wonky, there was a time when like 1 billion people were on Facebook already, but they were just starting to transition to pages where people could post content, not necessarily pictures, but like content meant for a wider audience. And the pages were really doing well in the algorithms, but nobody was really using them yet. And I just discovered it as a fluke. It wasn't even my friend's dad was like, yeah, I know you got a personal page. You got to make yourself a page. It's a different thing. He'd read an article or something about it. I was like, okay. And I started doing it. And that discipline of posting and that discipline of constantly putting it out, dovetailing with that moment in time, just allowed me to catch this wave that in many ways I'm still riding.
Yeah. So I just finished your new book, Humans, and it is really, really good. You interviewed thousands of people across, or tens of thousands even, across like 40 different countries.
Right.
What's the biggest thing you've learned about the human experience?
How to distill this? I think the most interesting way to comment on this is what I've learned about life as it is lived versus life as it is depicted in the media. I think what happens when we're consuming media, is that we don't necessarily realize or recognize the incentives that are involved. Ultimately, media is a storytelling business. Even very hard news media, it's like you want these stories to be factual, but ultimately they're stories. And what sells subscriptions and what's gets people to watch are the stories. And you want them to be stories that are about impactful things and current events and politics and stuff that makes a difference in the world and are factually, but there are stories. Knowing that the media industry is driven by stories, then you have to ask yourself, what are the elements of a story that make it most marketable, that make it most successful? And, what makes a good story is conflict. What makes a story is sex, violence, all of these kind of, extreme things, the same things that make a Hollywood movie good. And so what happens is when you're consuming the world through media, you are seeing the world through a lens that highlights and skews towards those extremes. Because what you do is you have somebody going into a country to tell a story, and they need to tell a good story to sell newspapers or to get people to watch. So they are looking for elements of life being lived that are filled with conflict or violence. So what happens is you get a lot of stories about terrorism, crime. You get a lot of stories that are sensational or have a lot of sex. And you can form an image of these places based on how you consume them in media that is much more frightening and extreme than you will find if you get on the ground. And the way that I describe it is that 99% of life being lived has nothing to do with politics, has nothing to do with crime, yet that's all we read about in the media. That, if you stop people one-on-one and ask them, what is it that you're thinking about all day long? What is it that you're carrying around with you? There's very similar themes in those answers that, we're mostly worried about our families. We're mostly worried about our son's drug addictions, our father's illness, our wife's, our wife's struggles with alcohol, whatever. And, those are kind of on the other side, those are the struggles. Our daughter's graduation, the person we met that we were wildly in love with. Like these are the stories that represent the life being lived. In countries, even countries like Iraq, even countries like Pakistan, where all you hear coming out through the media are about the conflicts going on. Still, 99% of life being lived is inside the home and, is much more intimate and, relationship driven.
So why are you so intrigued by the stories and the lives of regular people?
Well, first of all, that was all that was available to me. It's like at first it was just necessity. I'm a guy with a camera, no photography experience. You think the New Yorker's going to hire me? I mean, even a few years ago, they wrote an 5-page think piece about how, unrefined my work is or whatever this. It's like, I was a guy with a camera wanting to be a photographer, no credentials, no experience. I had to work with what was available to me. First, it was just photographing what was on the street. Then it was interviewing people on the street. And then I started learning stories from people on the street. And I got very good at that out of necessity. What it's grown into is realizing that, the social media audience of Humans in New York is a lot larger than the New York Times. It's a lot larger than the New Yorker. It's realizing that not only can the stories of ordinary people hold attention, they can be even more compelling and more relatable than stories of public figures and stories of celebrities and stories of violence and crime and corruption. And
they're much more relatable.
Exactly. Like we can identify, and so, it wasn't as a result of me realizing that the stories of ordinary people were going to be more compelling and then pursuing that path. It was looking for any path, and then that being the only path available to me. And in the course of getting very skilled at telling these stories, realizing that their inherent value was massive.
So the photo of the green lady kind of changed the trajectory of Humans of New York, right? In the beginning, it was portraits of people, but then it became also about the story. Can you tell that story?
All right. This is, about 6 or 7 months. And it sounds like such a short amount of time, but this was like 6 or 7 months of just me living and breathing and sleeping and doing nothing but photograph. So, I mean, I would say it was probably like 3 or 4 years worth of work. I mean, literally, it was all I did. I would come home, I'd be so tired after a long day of work, and I would just lay down and I would sleep for, your rest. It's like 6 times getting dark, and then I would go out to Times Square and try to get a few more portraits before the day was over. It's like, it's all I did. And so it's like 6 or 7 months of doing this all the time. And it was starting to get a little bit of traction. And I, at the time, was just taking photos of people. And then occasionally I would be writing my own captions, like a little observation. I try to be funny. I was 26. A lot of the stuff makes me cringe now. Just like little observations. Some of it was good. Some of it's still funny. Some of it still makes me laugh. But some of it was very 26.
It's still on your blog, right? Like I can go back and see it.
Yeah, well, it's also in the first book because this was largely what the first book was. It's like, and I think you feel a natural resistance going back and looking at your early work anyways, because you're just like, obviously, if you still thought it was good, you'd still be doing it. And like you have moved so much past it now. It's like, but that's still like the best-selling book I've ever had here. The first one, and it's been so resistant to go back and look at it. And I went recently, and a lot of it does kind of make me cringe. But yeah, some of it's like, okay, that was pretty funny. That was pretty funny because I was like writing my own captions, which I would never do now.
Right.
That is so far away from my ethos now. I would photograph somebody and add commentary. So a lot of times it would be trying to be funny, harmless. It wasn't ever anything mean, but that's so far from my ethos now, which I completely try to disappear. I write these very long form stories. And so I'd been doing that for months, just photographing people, occasionally adding my own caption. And there was getting a little bit of traction. And one day I photographed this lady dressed all in green. And then the next day I got sick and I couldn't go out and photograph. And remember, I was very disciplined at the time. I always had to post something on the blog. And I didn't have anything to post. And so I had this picture of the green lady, and it was a bad picture. I probably wouldn't have posted it otherwise because I really messed it up. But I put it up, and then I remember she had said something to me. She had said, I used to be a different color every single day, but one day I was green, and that was a great day. So I've been green for 15 years. And I was just like, okay, well, I'll just put that little quote above the picture. And I did. And it was by far the most liked, this is Facebook, most liked picture that I'd ever put up, which was like 100 likes. You know what I mean? Like, because my audience was tiny. And it was a eureka moment. It's like, wow, people are much more interested in learning about these people than they are in seeing these people, which makes sense, right? And so from that moment on, I think it's been 10 years now, and just yesterday they announced, the last book was a #1 New York Times bestseller. So it's been 10 years of maintaining a very large audience on the internet, which is very difficult to do.
It's also very powerful, which we'll talk about later. But
it's just difficult to hold attention at all on the internet, and especially for a sustained amount of time. And looking back, on it, I think one thing that I've always done is, no matter how much I've committed to empath, like when I feel the wind blowing a different direction, I would be willing to drop everything and follow that wind.
Is it just like a gut feeling, or is it response from the audience?
I'll give you like a great example. Like, I'd already signed a contract for my 4th book. It was going to be a book, and I'm still probably going to do this book eventually, of the remote interviews that I've been doing, because those are something that's very different, and they involve a bunch of extra photography. They're just very materially different than the stories that I've been telling beforehand. And that's always my requirement.
And this is during quarantine, you've been doing remote.
Yeah, but then it worked so well, I kept doing it. There you go. There's another example. It's like it was meant to just be during quarantine, but the stories were so engaging. I wasn't doing them random anymore. I had 20,000 submissions. And people were sending in extra photography, so they were visually much more engaging than the interviews I was doing on the street, because you would have these photos taking you through the person's life as you were reading the stories. And so I was going to make a book on that, and I'm working on that. And then Tanqueray happens, and this is something I wasn't sure if it was going to work. Telling a 12,000 word story on Instagram and Facebook. I'm not the official historian of social media, but I pay attention to it a lot. I've never seen anybody else do anything like it. Over 32 posts. And I was very unsure if it was going to work. And I worked for months on it. And seeing how well it did work, I was just like, clearly the audience is engaging with this material in a very deep way. And I just called my agent, just like, I think we need to stop this next book, and I've got to figure out how to do a book on Tanqueray or Stephanie. And, I don't know what that's going to be, but that's the way the wind is blowing right now. You know what I mean? And so it's just like the ability of, no matter how great one path seems, when another path opens up and, there's wind to immediately drop everything and go down that path. I've done it multiple times over the past 10 years. And I think that's why the blog has existed as long as it has. I mean, there's been no criticism that's ever been, I'm very proud of. There's been no criticism. There's been some valid criticism written about Humans of New York. There's been no criticism that's written about Humans of New York that's still applied 2 years later. It's just like after the work has always changed so quickly. It's always been evolving so quickly and morphing and changing so quickly that you can never pin it down.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes I got the habit of, I guess, a creator to read bad things written about you on the internet, and I think it's made me better. It hurts when you read it, but people make valid points and they see weaknesses and inconsistencies in your work that you can remedy, and they exist. And so, I've consumed that when people analyze and critique my work. And, it's one thing that makes me proud is that when I go back 1 or 2 years and I read, old criticism, it's like by the time I'm reading it, the work has already evolved and changed so much that it's no longer applicable.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about chance and randomness and selecting the people that you photograph and the stories that you tell. But how do you go about choosing a certain person over, the one sitting right next to them?
Well, so I mean, again, this is, am I answering about Humans of New York 2 years ago, or am I answering about Humans of New York now? It's like, Humans of New York 2 years ago, like it was all random. It was all random. And I would just walk through what I was mainly looking for. The one variable that I needed most was time. I tried to choose as wide of a selection, go to as many different neighborhoods as possible. But the one thing I needed from everybody was time. These interviews take time. A lot of times they take an hour, they take an hour and a half. They're pretty intense. And so I would normally be looking for somebody who was in a state of repose. Maybe they're sitting on a bench, maybe they're leaning up against a wall, smoking a cigarette. A lot of cigarette smokers on Humans of New York. I know they have a little bit of time. So beforehand, it was time. Now my selection process involves an inbox full of 20,000 stories. My assistant has cut them down a little bit. Maybe she's cut out 50% of them, just to give me a fighting chance. But, I'm reading and, it's taken me, I'm still, all 20,000 of these emails came in within like 72 hours of me asking for stories. Like the people I'm replying to now, like wrote in months ago and I've completely forgotten they'd written in. Now I'm just like dropping, hey, I'm sorry, I'm just getting to this. And so what I do now is I'm looking, that's why the work's changed so much recently. It's gone from looking for anybody and then focusing on the interview. Now the interview is much less important because so much information is already laid out there. And so I'm looking at the story and I'm judging it based on characteristic and variables that I've learned through experience. Not just a compelling story, but a story that is compelling and will work in short form, which is my art. I have 2,200 characters. That is the character limit on Instagram. And so I'm looking for stories that are going to maintain their weight and their impact when constricted into a short form.
So you might have an hour-long, really deep conversation with someone. How do you decide what to pull out that would represent them in that specific moment in time?
It's all contextual. Every interview is different. I don't ever have a list of questions or anything, and it's different. The street interviews are a lot different than the remote interviews because the street interviews always start from zero. And I'm trying to identify the events and conflicts in their life upon which I can build a story around. That, and normally, I will let them lead the interview. I will say, what is your biggest challenge right now? Either that or what is the biggest challenge that you've overcome? Chances are the biggest challenge that they've overcome is the thing that has formed them the most, one, and the two, the thing that they've spent the most time thinking about. So not only is it going to be the story that's most impactful and material to their life and who they become, but it's also going to be the story that's given them the most perspective, platform, and impact, or not insight into the world. It's like everybody's an expert in their particular problem. You know what I mean? Because that's what we think about the most. And so it's like, and everybody has a very distinct struggle in their life, and that they've been forced to compensate for and create solutions for and think about. And it's given them a very unique perspective on the world formed by that struggle. And it's like, if you can find what that person's struggling with, you can a lot of times find the one thing that they can speak to with more wisdom than anybody else. And so that's when I'm on the street, what I'm normally looking for. We're talking about struggles. We're talking about things that have been overcome. With the remote interviews, the story's there, it's in front of me. A lot of times I would just use that as scaffolding. And then I'm a lot of times, and it changes every time. Sometimes there's just these amazing writers that just make my job super easy. A lot of times there's a relationship that I know is a fascinating relationship, but I need the thread, I need the arc that's going to turn it into a story where, it starts and then something happens and there's some resolution and some change. And so, those interviews are, about either trying to take something that, like, oh, my dad was a motorcyclist and he was the, greatest stuntman in, Western Canada. And he, hopped over, hundreds of cliffs, but he always came home every single night and, was telling, and it's just clear that it's a very interesting character, but Humans of New York's not good in biographies. It can't do cradle to grave. Like, that doesn't work. And so it's the story, what is the story that can be told on this blog? And that's always the puzzle, is taking a interesting relationship or an interesting life or an interesting person and getting it into a story that I can tell about something that happened in this person's life, that when that story's over, you feel like the person in the same way that if you just read a narrative of their life from the beginning to the end.
Yes. So in your book, my favorite part is where you talk about how people, when you interview them, they typically start with cliches and generalities, and they stick to their talk track, basically. And then you wrote, truth is often spoken haltingly, with pauses, like it's being dug up one spoonful at a time from somewhere deep. How does it feel to be on the receiving end of people's really, really heavy truths?
Well, I mean, I always think that it's people ask a lot of times, especially when the stories are very sad. How do you listen to these sad stories over and over again without being affected? And because I've done series in pediatric cancer wards, I've done series where I spent weeks with refugees, fleeing from Syria, and I'm learning about their history and their lives. I think there's something about the really good interview that's an exchange. It's not just one way where you're asking questions and then you're getting answers. I think by confronting a person on a very deep level and pushing them on things that other people don't push them on, that are important to them, and then giving them the respect of listening very intently. I mean, challenging somebody is a form of respect. It shows that you're listening to them so closely that you're noticing inconsistencies and you're noticing where things don't add up. And so you're pushing them on it. You're pushing them to explain not only to you, but to themselves why they've been holding this belief or why they've been thinking that. And, when you're coming from a place of this intense listening, there's no question that you can ask. It's too private, too confrontational, too personal, because it can be sensed that it's coming from this authentic and organic place, and this place of pure curiosity and pure interest and pure presence, as opposed to asking these questions as a means to an end. That moment doesn't get reached in every interview. That place, it's not a moment, it's a place. Like that place doesn't get reached in every interview, but it gets reached, I would say, in every interview that makes it on the blog. And, there's something about that where there's this knowledge that I am benefiting from hearing the story, and this person's also benefiting from telling the story. And more often than not, at the end of the interview, both of us are thanking each other. I'm thanking them for telling the story, and they're thanking me for listening. So, I think that's how it feels to be on, the receiving end. It's kind of this moment, no matter how sad the story is, you leave feeling like, it was a very healthy thing for both people involved, and that's a good feeling.
And I think that's how a lot of the people who read the blog also feel, right?
And that's, there you go. That's the third, and that's the interesting part of it, because that's like, what a lot of creators, the only thing they think about is what happens when it's posted, right? But for me, when the conversation's over, so much of the magic's already happened. It's in the moment, it's on the street. And the Success of Humans of New York, it's maintained in these FaceTime interviews that I've been having. These moments where you're like, you're going to places in somebody's minds with them for the first time, and it's good for them and it's healthy, and you're there and you're witnessing it and you're watching it. And, it's a powerful thing, especially when it's something that somebody's been avoiding confronting for a long time. And it's a magical thing. And the Success of Humans of New York has been translating as much of the magic of what happens on the street in the moment, in the one-on-one interview, to the blog as possible. But it's the magic's over before I even start typing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And again, I think that's the power of it. Is there's something very real that happens. It's a very emotional moment. There's always a lot of emotion in these street interviews for me and this person. Like, there's this very real communion. There's this very real moment, and that exists, and that's not fake. And it's taking as much of that and putting it in a jar, you know what I mean? Reconstructing it in a way that maintains the person's voice, that maintains their intent. The photograph maintains their emotion. I like to capture people while they're talking. because I want the audience to be there and feel like what it was like to sit there and listen to that person. And yeah, I think the better that I've gotten at that over the years, the more impactful the work's become.
And in a world of, so many quotes taken out of context, like the reason I love Humans of New York is you get the context and you get the intent. I never feel like somebody's, their words have been taken out of context, and it sounds like you, for example. So tell me about Tanqueray and your friendship with her, because that's the story that kind of captivated the nation. Just tell me about how it all started.
Well, that all started very organically. I think what's so interesting about it is, I've had thousands and thousands of interviews and conversations with people, but almost random people on the street. Almost all of those have been within, the framework of doing my work. I carry around my camera. I very systematically force interact with random people. It's a system. I have to approach a certain amount of people every single day. A certain percentage of those people are going to say no. A certain percentage of those people are going to allow me to do an interview. And then of those, a certain percentage of the interviews will be usable. And I classify a usable interview as one where the person felt comfortable enough to be honest it's not about a person being interesting or not interesting. It's about their comfort level with the process. So anyways, it's a system. And that's how I meet, all of these amazing people that I meet and have all these amazing conversations. What was interesting about Tanqueray is I wasn't in that framework. I was coming back from the gym. I didn't have my camera with me.
She called you out on...
Yeah, exactly. I just run 3 miles and I was soaking wet with sweat, I'm sure. And I was just like, it was a cold day. And I was like, I get to this thing where it's like, I don't really want to put on like a sweater, like after I hop off the treadmill, or a hoodie or anything. I don't want to get anything that, I just want to get home and take a shower. And so even though it was really cold, I'm like, it's not that far. I'm just going to walk. And so I'm walking and I've got my shorts on and my t-shirt, and she's got this huge fur coat. And I was just like, oh, she's great. And it's one thing that I kind of do. It's like when I see somebody who's, of a certain generation that has put a lot of effort into their style, and it's, they look great, I make sure that I tell them, I always tell them,
she looked exquisite.
Exactly. And so I said, hey, you look great. And she called me over and she said, let me ask you something. Why do you white boys always wear shorts in the winter?
Which is a valid question.
I guess it's a thing. I didn't realize it was a thing until I heard people's response to her quote. It's a thing, apparently. Just white boys, shorts in winter. And so that's what got me over talking to her. And right away she launched into all these stories. Like, where do you live? Oh, I live right there. Oh, that house used to be full of hookers. And that and that. And I know because in the 1970s, like, she spoke for like 10 minutes before I ever got a word in. I think most people would be looking at their watch being like, oh my gosh, like I gotta go somewhere. But me being who I am and like what my job is, I'm like, oh my God, this woman can tell some stories. This is crazy. You know what I mean? And I'm just like, even in the beginning, I was still, because remember, I just stepped off a treadmill. I was still kind of like, I need to get home, and just like, it's the first, so I'm kind of like leaning away, like, oh, that's great. Like, about Stephanie, and I say this to her face, it's nothing, she will go for 60 minutes without taking a breath. And like, you have to jump in. And so I'm like, I'm talking with her and the minutes are passing, I'm freezing. And so I'm just like, thinking about this story just got so good. I'm just like, I cannot believe this. So I said, after a while, after about 10 or 15 minutes, like, will you just wait here? Like, I can't explain it really, but I run a website and I take pictures of people and tell their stories. Can I run home and get my camera and do a little interview with you? And I was like, I ran home, which wasn't too far. And I remember being so afraid that she was going to be gone when I got back, which now knowing her, there's no way she would have been able to get that far down the road. But I got back and she was still there. We did the interview. She still really had no idea what I showed her, but she completely forgot Humans in New York. That meant nothing to her until she started getting stopped on the streets like a couple days later when I posted and like, oh my God, it's you. Oh my God, it's you. Oh my God, it's you. So that began it all. And, there's this frenzy after I posted her story. all these people wanted to, make a television series or a, movie out of it. And she wanted to work with me. I think she's a very smart woman, and she didn't need to see numbers on social media to know that something that this guy did has 50 people stopping me on the streets in the course of an hour. And I want to work with him. Like, that's just what she got in her mind. Like, she probably doesn't fully understand humans in New York, but that's her street smarts. She just knows, she's not a social media expert. She just knows something that this guy did has got everybody knowing who I am, and I want to work with him. And so she kept saying that, and she took a few meetings, like television meetings and movie meetings. It was kind of a frenzy. And at some point I was like, all right, well, you want to work with me? And I'm thinking, it's like, this could be the best story I have an opportunity to tell. Like, why give this to somebody else to tell? Like, why? This is what I do. Why am I handing this story over to somebody else to tell? So I was like, well, how about we do this? How about we work together? We're going to make a podcast together, and it was going to be like a first-person podcast she was going to do in her own voice. And we were just going to split everything. And that was our plan. And we, did it for months and months. We met and just did tons of interviews. And that's when her health kind of took a turn for the worse. And so I was like, I don't have time to do this, because she needs help now. And so I just quickly retooled everything for the blog, which involved basically just cutting out 60% of it, 60% wild stuff. And that's how it happened. And that's how we are here where we are today.
Wow. So it was a 32-part series that it ended up?
32 posts. Yeah.
A post. Yep.
Yeah. And every single one of them bumping up against the limit of what Instagram would allow me to post. Yeah.
So it was amazing for me to see, because I have a newsletter called The Profile that features profiles, but they're traditional profiles, right? It's a 3,000 word story in New York Magazine, and it's text, and it's not entirely in the person's voice.
Right.
But what you did completely revolutionized that, but it's no less powerful. I would argue even more, because I got to hear her, right?
Right.
Her story was twists and turns and pain and struggle, but there was no regret, right? Mm-hmm. Why do you think people...
That's true. That's one thing about Stephanie. That's true.
Zero regret.
There's zero regret, yes.
Why do you think... So you started a GoFundMe for her, ended up raising $2.7 million the last time I checked, from hundreds of thousands of people. Why do you think that complete strangers empathize with the struggle so much more than the joy and the planned path?
Yeah, we connect much more to each other's pain than we do our successes. I think you look at social media, and it's a lot of people bragging about what they have. And that is, look what I have. It's implicit, it's not direct, but a lot of it, the underlying energy is, look what I'm achieving, look what I have, look what I've experienced that you don't have. And that is separating, you know what I mean? That's a separating energy. When somebody is saying, look what I'm going through, that is a connective energy. Because what it does is it taps into, I think the one most singular emotion is pain. It's the one that can't be divided and can't be split. There's not as many, great date. There's all different types of happiness and peace and contentment. But, pain is pain, and hurt is hurt. And people know, even though it's got 100 million different masks and faces, underneath it is the singular feeling of pain that people know and people can experience. And to really identify with somebody and have compassion and empathy for them is to identify pain in others, the same pain that you felt, even though it might not have the same causes. And so, I think that is why the story of other people's struggles and the stories of Tangeray's struggles in particular tapped into such a nerve, because it's to really know pain in other people is to know yourself in them.
Yeah, totally. One thing that I can't stop thinking about after reading her story is that it's just like mind-boggling to think that her story would go undocumented if it wasn't for a total stranger's curiosity and willingness to listen. And it made me think about, like, I recently, a few years ago, I interviewed my great-grandmother, who was still alive at the time, and she told me things that I was like, God, you were young once too.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that stories as interesting and as wild and as crazy exist within our own families, but why do you think so few people take the time to ask? And do you have some sort of crazy curiosity that the rest of us don't?
Well, I mean, remember, my interviews are within the structure of my work. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's even my me and my own wife. She's like, what maybe you should be asking me. Like, yeah, it's like there's something about intimacy, something about being really close to somebody, which makes these difficult conversations tougher to have. And I'm going to figure it out one day. I've been thinking about it a lot. Like, why is it so much? I can feel the resistance. Why is it so much harder for me to ask my mom and my wife and my brother these questions that I ask a complete stranger? And on the flip side of that, why is it so much easier for a complete stranger to tell me these things than it would be to tell their mom or their brother or their sister? There is, and I don't, again, I'm going to figure it out one day. But my thinking so far is that relationships are tough. It's really hard to make a relationship work, a close relationship. And you get to a place where everything is working and the ship is sailing along, and you're really afraid of introducing new truths and new information that is going to change that dynamic and throw that off course. And I think that's my only reason why I think people are so, there's something about intimacy, the proximity. There's something about the proximity you have to another person that makes these searing questions so much harder to ask than if you don't know them at all. And on the flip side, they're so much easier to answer if you don't know the person at all. That is some strange power and strange wrinkle of the universe that fuels my work. That people would confide in me in this way. And I'm yet to fully understand the mechanisms behind why it works.
Cool. So I know we're running close on time, but I want to ask you, you've spent the last 10 years telling everybody else's story. Is there one thing about you or your story that you wish people knew?
Oh, then I would know. I wish people knew none of it. I'm very, again, I've always wanted Humans of New York to be bigger than I am. I want it to be.
Why?
Because it's better than me. It's more pure than me. It makes more of a difference in people's lives than I do as a concept. And the more I can disappear with my own human weaknesses and inconsistencies and bad opinions and bad thinking, that the stronger the work can become because it's not tethered to me. I am, so much of social media is personality driven. All of it is. And, Humans of New York is not at all. And my personality is not in there at all, or I try to conceal it. And I think so much of its success is because of that. And so, I am the most comfortable, and I think the work is the best, the least visible I am. And yeah, it's something that, I always wonder what the right balance of that is, because I ask myself, maybe I'd like to do something as Brandon Stanton one day, you know what I mean? But I've been hiding Brandon Stanton as much as I possibly can. And then I question the wisdom of that sometime. But, ultimately in my quiet moments, I come back to, the more you disappear, the better things are. And then, a lot of times I'll write a little comment. I'm going to be like, oh, social media practices. I need to engage with the community in the comment section. I'll write a little comment. I almost always regret it. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Oh, I shouldn't have said anything. I just shouldn't have said anything. So it's just like, I always come back to, the less of me that is visible in Humans of New York, the better Humans of New York is.
And is there one thing that you wish people would ask you about Humans of New York that they don't? I love how uncomfortable you get talking about yourself. This is great.
No. It's just like, no, it's like I said, I'm most comfortable when I'm working with somebody to be kind of a channel and a vessel for their stories. I love talking about the craft of it. You know what I mean? Like I love talking about how I interview, and I enjoy talking about how I write, and I like talking about the craft. As far as the meaning of the work and the purpose of the work, that feels like you're pulling your ego into it, and you're pulling, your persona into it, in a way that doesn't feel right to me. So it's like I like talking about it, but I like talking about the craft of creating it, and not me necessarily. So yeah, those are the tracks that I'm most comfortable driving on.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you so much, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you, Polina.